Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, let's discuss the complete set of automation testing interview questions which are very important for interviews. And if you need this PDF, I have given a link in the description and also in the comment section. Please do check out. Okay, so let's get started. What are the challenges you have faced during testing? You can tell something to the interviewer like, um, handling the dynamic web element was challenging, and handling the pop-ups and alerts, synchronization issues, cross-browser compatibility issues, test data management issues, element staleness, flaky test cases, CI/CD integration and API integration. Okay, so the next question is about what are the strategies did you follow while building a Selenium framework from scratch? This question they ask when you have worked on Selenium framework from very scratch. Okay, you can tell the design pattern that you have chosen for preparing the framework and what are the unit testing framework that you have chosen and the testing frameworks and how did you implement the utilities and about the CI/CD integration and how did you incorporate the parallel execution. Okay, so these are the things that you can highlight. So the next question is about where do you perform the singleton design pattern? If you don't use it, do you have an idea about this? Okay, so here is a sample piece of code. Okay, and the next question goes like difference between implicit wait, explicit wait and fluent waits in Selenium. And the next question is about pros and cons of implicit wait and explicit wait. Then why do we prefer explicit wait instead of fluent wait? What are the disadvantages of fluent wait? Without implicit wait, will the Selenium script work? What is the default polling time in explicit wait and implicit wait? Explain the synchronization in Selenium. Which concept is implemented in explicit and fluent wait? Explain the abstraction and interface with respect to the Selenium. Can you explain the difference between factory design and singleton framework or the pattern? So what is a page object and page factory model? Okay. Have you used interface in your framework other than Selenium interfaces? Okay. How do you achieve inheritance in your framework? What is a WebDriver? Name the methods without implementation. Which is the fastest locator in Selenium? What does double colon in XPath represent? Explain the driver.manage.window.maximize. Difference between get and navigate.to. How would you check for broken links on a web page? Difference between submit and click in Selenium. And what's the difference between absolute XPath and relative XPath? And what's the difference between find element and find elements? What's the difference between frames and iframes? What is the return type of find element and find elements? What error will be thrown when no element is found for find element and find elements? What are the exceptions you frequently faced in Selenium? How to handle stale element reference exception? What are the interfaces used in Selenium? Where is inheritance concept used in Selenium framework? And how do you initialize web elements in page object model? What happens if not initialized? Okay, so the next question is about if both implicit wait and explicit waits are used, which takes the priority? What's the difference between close and quit in Selenium? How do you handle alerts in Selenium? How do you handle pop-ups? How to handle a file upload when input tag does not have the type equal to file parameter? Okay. How do you perform keyboard operations in Selenium? What does this below code snippet mean? Okay. And where can be dynamic polymorphism be observed in the Selenium WebDriver project? What is the difference between single forward slash and double forward slash in XPath? If proper XPath CSS selector and ID are not available, how do you identify an object? What are the attributes of CSS selector? Which is faster, XPath or CSS? How to get the nth element using XPath and CSS selector? How to find the parent or grandparent using only CSS? Will driver.find elements throw an exception? What is returned by driver.manage? How to find an element with dynamic ID? How to initialize elements in page object model? How to get the values from a dropdown and print them in ascending order? Using tree set, how to find the unique elements using tree set? This takes screenshot, an interface or a class. Why use Selenium despite many third-party libraries? Why we use build and perform with actions class and what are the benefits? Can we use perform alone in scripting without build? Difference between build and perform in Selenium. What's the return type of get window handle and get window handles? How to switch back to the parent window in Selenium? If a button is disabled, how to check using get attribute? Explain the method overloading with Selenium and an example. Okay. So how do you read Excel file in Selenium? Okay. These are the counter questions to the previous question. How do you handle the different data types and how to write the data into the Excel sheet? Okay. And do you use a property file in your framework? Which Java concept is used? How to handle unpredictable pop-ups in Selenium? How to re-execute failed test cases in a different browser? How to handle dynamic web elements? Okay, how to click the last option in a drop-down? How to count the links on a web page? What is page factory in page object model? How to achieve POM if the application has 10 pages? What are the annotations used in page object model? How to find the broken links in Selenium? How to handle frames in Selenium? What are the different types of navigation commands in Selenium? How to handle alerts in Selenium? What's the difference between assert and verify? How to download a file using Selenium? How to manage data tables in Selenium? How to automate localization testing? How to avoid no such element exception? How to handle dynamic web tables? How to check if an element is enabled without is enabled method? Why is CSS selector faster than the XPath? Why do companies still use XPath? Why is an element not found even though it's visible? And how to execute Selenium in headless mode? How to get a text from a text box if get text is not working? How to solve element not found error even with the correct locator? Okay, what are the few starting initial steps in writing login page.java in page object model? How to handle Windows pop-ups in Selenium? What are the different ways to handle hidden elements? What's the difference between click in web element and actions class? Can we change the test behavior at runtime? How to handle high frames windows, tables and alerts? How to perform right click in Selenium? How to scroll down to a page? What will get window handles return? How to automate Windows applications? And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the TestNG framework, unit testing framework. Okay, so what is the importance of TestNG framework? Why do we use TestNG in the frameworks? And to the previous question, you can tell why we use the TestNG framework in the TestNG unit testing framework in the framework, or the TestNG library in the frameworks. Okay, so and then what is the purpose of testng.xml file? What is the purpose of listeners? How to run the same method 100 times in testng? And the next question is about the reporting tool. Seventh question is about the annotations in testng and their order. What is a data provider? What's the difference between factory and data provider annotation? Performing a parallel execution in testng. How to run only the failed test cases in testng. How to take screenshot for failed test cases. How to run the same test 10 times. What are the different types of listeners in testng? What's the difference between before suite and after suite? How to add or remove test cases in testng.xml file? How many suites can be there in the testng? Syntax to perform parallel testing in testng. Can we have multiple suites in one XML file? What is invocation count? Okay. And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the Cucumber and BDD. What is a Cucumber and why it is used in BDD? Okay. What is a gherkin? What are gherkin keywords? How do you structure feature files in Cucumber? What's the difference between scenario and scenario outline? How are step definitions mapped to a feature file? Steps. How do you parameterize steps in Cucumber? What happens if multi-step definitions match the same step? What are tags in Cucumber and how are they used? What are hooks at before and at after in Cucumber? How do you handle test data in Cucumber scenarios? How do you integrate Cucumber with Selenium WebDriver? Can you run Cucumber tests in parallel? What's the difference between scenario and scenario outline? How do you handle dynamic locators in Cucumber? How to handle Windows pop-up in Selenium? How do you run only the failed test cases in Selenium? How to handle alerts in Selenium? How to scroll down to a page? What is a page factory? How do you capture screenshots? How to handle multiple windows? Okay. Within the testng, what's the difference between before method and before class annotations? How do you run the Cucumber tests in parallel? How to handle the web tables in Selenium? Okay, the next set of interview questions are with respect to the Maven. Okay, can you explain the life cycle of a Maven? And the usage of Maven Surefire plugin. What is the use of pom.xml file? How to handle dependencies at runtime in Maven? What if dependencies are deleted from pom.xml file? how to pass different data for different environments, what are the basic Maven commands, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the CI/CD and Jenkins. What is Jenkins? How to configure a Jenkins job? How do you schedule deployments in Jenkins? What are the two components Jenkins is integrated with? What is a version control system? What's the difference between group ID and artifact ID in the Maven? How and when is Jenkins used in your automation? Okay. And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the API testing covering REST, Postman, authorization, and OAuth and status codes. Okay. What's the difference between REST and SOAP API, UI or API? What's the difference between put and patch? How to integrate Postman into a project? How to handle dynamic payloads in API testing? How to capture the API response and pass it to another request? What are the challenges in API testing? What's the difference between authentication and authorization? What are the common API status codes? What's the difference between OAuth 1.0 and OAuth 2.0? How to pass API response from one call to another? And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the Java core concepts. Okay, why string is immutable in Java? What is a static in Java? What is final in Java? What is this in Java? What is finally and where do we use it? What is autoboxing and unboxing? What is serialization and deserialization? What is an abstract modifier? What is call by value and call by reference? What are the primitive and non-primitive types in Java? What is method overloading? Give an example. Why override hash code when overriding equals method? Difference between checked and unchecked exceptions. Difference between final, finally and finalize. Difference between abstract class and interface. Difference between string builder and string buffer. Difference between array and array list. Can we create an object of an abstract class? Can the constructor be overloaded? Can we override the main method? Can we overload the main method? Can we overload static methods? Difference between hash map and hash set. How to check if an array is empty or null? Can we execute Java without main method? Can we call a non-static variable in a static method? Can I execute multiple catch blocks without try block? How to achieve serialization and deserialization in Java? What happens if main method is declared as private? What are the classes available in list interface? What is the use of constructors in Java? What is hash map? Can we store objects in hash map? What's the difference between hash map and hash set? How to check if an array is empty or null? Can we execute Java without main method? Where did you use hash map in your project? Where did you use OOPS concepts in your automation framework? This is a very important question. Okay. What's the difference between access modifiers in Java and their scope? What is meant by thread? What is a singleton class? Difference between static binding and dynamic binding. Is hash map a thread safe? What is static and how to set value of static variable? Can we overload private methods? Can we extend a final class? Can we override static methods? Can we overload main method? Can we initialize a variable in an interface? What would happen if Java allowed multiple inheritance? And questions on the exception hierarchy in Java. Difference between the set and map. What is inheritance? Difference between overloading and overriding. Difference between encapsulation and abstraction. Throw versus throws. What is polymorphism? How and when to use the interfaces. Can we instantiate an interface? Can we overload main method in Java? Can we override a constructor? Where do you use polymorphism in Java? What is system.out.println and its use case? What's the difference between final and finally? Can we use multiple catch blocks? What's the difference between Apache POI and JXL? Okay, and the next set of interview questions are with respect to the deeper core concepts. How to prevent a method from being overridden in Java? Why is the main method static? What is the use of static variables? Difference between list and set? How will you access default and protected members of a class? Why is object creation not possible for abstract class? Design patterns of Java in Java. What do all classes in Java collection framework have? When to use the abstraction and when to use interface? Does Java provide a default constructor? Difference between array list and linked list and when to use them? Difference between the below two declarations? Difference between hash map and multi-map? When should a method be static and non-static? How does hash map work internally? What executes first, constructor or a main method? What is a poja and why it is used? How do you call a method from a parent class when child class overrides it? Okay, and next set of interview questions are with respect to the programming based. Swap two string without using a third variable. How to find the duplicates in a given string. How to find the string length without using the length method. Can you find the largest number in an array? Reverse a string without using reverse method. And program to find and write the Fibonacci series. Print even numbers from an array. How to find the special characters, numbers, capital and small letters in a string. How to check if a number is a palindrome. How to reverse an integer without using built-in method. How to check if two strings are anagrams. How to find the highest number in an array. Okay. And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the manual testing. What is a test plan? Explain the bug life cycle. Difference between smoke and sanity testing. Difference between regression and retesting. Difference between functional and regression testing. What's the difference between severity and priority? What's the difference between test plan and test strategy? What's the difference between boundary value analysis and equivalence partitioning? What's the difference between white box and black box testing? How to select test cases for automation in a 1000 test case suite? Can a method return multiple values in Java? What is bug triage? What is exploratory testing? What is ad hoc testing? What is build acceptance testing? What is difference between validation and verification? Severity and priority examples. Okay, test case priority execution order. Difference between inner join and outer join. Difference between delete, drop and truncate. What are the different test case design techniques? What is a deferred bug? How to decide what test cases to automate, when to stop testing, how to reduce the test execution time. Okay, how many test cases are in your regression test suite? How long does it take to execute? How to cover character keyboard operations using user defined keywords? What are the most important things to define in a bug? Can you share any achievements you have done in automation? Difference between BDD and TDD? What is a test plan, steps to create one? What are inbound and outbound testing? Difference between smoke regression and sanity testing? What is the next step if a developer rejects an open defect? Can you explain the test metrics? How do you prioritize tests? How do you perform an automation code review? How to segregate 250 manual test cases into smoke, sanity and regression? What makes a test case a good candidate for automation? What are regression, sanity and smoke test scripts? When are regression, sanity and smoke test scripts executed? And the next questions are with respect to the agile methodology and scrum related. What is agile methodology? What is scrum and who is your scrum master? Okay, I mean, what role that scrum master play? What are the agile ceremonies do you follow? What is a retrospective meeting? Describe the Scrum ceremony. When do you automate in the current sprint or in the next sprint? Explain the velocity in sprint. In a tight sprint schedule, if a new requirement is added, how will you handle it? What is a backlog in Scrum? You have 30 plus sprints in your release. How will you design your test scripts and run them? And the next set of interview questions are with respect to the managerial round. How will you be an asset to the team? Why are you looking for a job change? How soon you can join? Can you join? Suppose we assign you only manual testing for 6 months to a year, what will you do? How interested are you in learning new technologies? What are the failures in your work life? As a lead, or how do you define the quality of a product before the release? In case if you are a lead, you can expect this question. Okay, and then a new team member joins when a deadline is near. How do you onboard them efficiently? As a QA, where do you see yourself after 3 years? What are your strengths and weakness? What are the best practices you learned and the impact they made? After running the regression tests, if new regression bugs are found, how will you prioritize them? Okay, so guys, these are all the very important interview questions which you can expect in the interview. So I have uploaded this PDF in a link that I mentioned in the description and also in the comment section. Please do check out. Okay, so this is a interview preparation kit, so which helps in cracking any interviews, and it covers the actual questions asked in almost all the top companies, and covers effective study materials. Even this PDF, whatever I went through now, is also included in this interview preparation kits, and it has been designed for 0 to 15 plus years of experienced candidates, and it has been crafted after taking 3500 plus automation interviews. Okay, so please do check out. I have mentioned the link in the description and also in the comment section. Okay, so thank you so much for watching my video. All the best for your upcoming interview. Stay tuned for more updates. Happy learning, happy testing. Thank you.